Good morning and welcome to Rakestraw Books live at home. This morning we are joined by author Hannah Rothschild, who will be discussing her novel House of Trelawney, which was just published in paperback. As most of you know, this was one of my very favorite books last year, so it is a particular thrill to have her here with us this morning. So I'm going to let her talk for a few minutes, and then I will come back on and we'll have conversation and I'll take questions from all of you. You can ask questions either in chat or by clicking the Ask a Question box at the bottom of your screen. And thank you so much for joining us. This is Hannah Rothschild.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice. I'm sorry that I can't see you all, but I'm with you in spirit. I'm actually in the Middle East, so I feel like quite a long way from everybody. But I'm being so touched and also enthused and inspired by Rothschild's support, your bookshop support for my novel. And it's very exciting, you know, when one connects with readers, particularly at times of COVID, where we've all felt so disconnected from everybody. I've certainly been locked down in the middle of the British countryside most of the time. I haven't seen anyone apart from my children and my partner. And I've really, really missed connecting with readers, hearing your stories, your reactions, and also, hearing everyday conversation, which is the kind of meat and potatoes, if you like, of my writing. So House of Trelawney. So House of Trelawney came about, the long story is that when I was much younger, a friend of mine, who is still my closest friend, went to India. And about 5 years ago, I found some letters from her in an old drawer, and I'd completely forgotten about them. And I got these letters out. We were both about 20, and we were writing home to other friends and to my parents. And it was so evocative reading the letters that I had written to my very close girlfriend that I thought I've got to try and use this somehow. So the first idea for this book came about really thinking about female friendship and how much I'd relied on this particular friendship with this friend of mine. And then that's not really enough, though, to create a novel. And the next thing I was thinking about was the crash of 2008 and the enormous effect that it had on all of our lives and possibly on our politics as well. And I'll come on to that a bit later. And then the third thing I was thinking about was my love of huge English houses, those great big old stately homes that, you know, one comes across driving through the British countryside. And these three ideas started to kind of gel. And I had then the next thought, which was that why don't I kind of create a huge fictional castle, and in that castle kind of put some friends, and then imagine what might have happened to those friends during the financial crash of 2008. And it was the kind of confluence of those three ideas that led to the beginning of the book. So the book actually opens, and the first chapter is really about this extraordinary place and what had happened to it. And it had been in the same family for 800 years, but they were better at spending money than making money. So gradually over time, they forgot to kind of keep it up, or they ran out of money in order to kind of put the roof on. And every time a bit of roof fell in, or every time a window fell in, or every time there was a terrible storm, which there always is in that part of Cornwall, which is where the house is, they just used to close the door on that room and pretend that it wasn't, you know, that it hadn't really happened. So when we meet our family in 2008, they're now living in about 3 rooms in the castle. That's all they can afford to heat. And they live off mints because that's all they can afford to buy at the local kind of supermarket. And the family is held together by Jane, who is, when we meet her, in her 40s, and she's longing to be an artist and a creative person in her own right. But her entire life is devoted to trying to keep kind of bread on the table and keep her family together. Meanwhile, her husband, Kitto, fancies himself as a bit of a kind of Jack the Lad in the city. So he, guess what, you know, goes about losing even more money if that's possible. And their 3 children have gone completely feral. But at the heart of Jane's sadness is not the fact that she's broke. The real sadness is the fact that she's lost touch with her erstwhile great girlfriends. So when we see her, really what she's thinking about is not the fact that she can't afford a manicure or a pedicure or all the things that you would imagine a countess, a title person might be able to afford. What she's really thinking about is just her abject loneliness, stuck there in this beautiful crumbling pile in Cornwall. Okay, so that's the introduction. And I don't know, Michael, whether there's anything you want to pick up from that.
Well, where I would like to start is with those friendships. Jane and her sister-in-law, Blaise, and with the lost Anastasia. Because those three women, even though we never see Anastasia in life, drive the story. And then, of course, there is Aisha and the Dowager Countess, Clarissa, and Jane's own troubling daughter. All these powerful women. So if you would like to talk about them.
Mm. Yeah. So, I mean, it'll probably come to no surprise, I'm a woman and I like writing about strong women. So at the heart of this book, I wanted to put some complex relationships about women. So as you said, there are three great girlfriends: Anastasia, Blaise, who was born in the castle, but this is not uncommon, incidentally, that the women often of these grand families were expected to kind of go off and get married and vacate. And in Blaise's case, she didn't find relationships very easy, but she was told to vacate anyway. So as it happened, she was quite good at maths, so she goes to London, and she, in fact, has a very good career in the city. And her friend Jane marries her brother Kitto, as I said earlier on, who fancies himself as something in the city, but is hopelessly inept. Kitto's mother, Clarissa, who is incredibly entitled, self-important, kind of grande dame, of the best sort, is also living there. And she's refusing to accept that the family's, fallen on hard times. So she changes for dinner with her husband every night, and they put on their best taffeta gowns and a little bit of a fox fur. And they change for dinner, and they wait for the butler to bring them food. And of course, the butler is Jane, who's also the cook, who's also the washer-up. But Clarissa cannot bear the thought that life has changed. So she's just going to plow on regardless. And what happens, the plot hinges, the first kind of the big thing that happens is that Anastasia writes to her two former best friends, Blaise and Jane, saying that she's dying. She's caught dengue fever and she's dying. And would they look after her daughter? Well, Blaise, works in the city. The idea of looking after a child is kind of horrifying. She doesn't want anything to do with children. She thinks they're ghastly things which should be seen and not heard. And Jane, frankly, just doesn't need another child. She's a pretty inept mother. She can't really feed her own children, who've gone completely feral, kind of running around the battlements, not going to school. You can imagine filling balloons full of water and chucking them at each other. So she doesn't want another child. So this poor young 18-year-old girl arrives in England, the daughter of Anastasia, and unwanted. And that's the first bomb that's exploded in the lives of this family. And I don't want to give too much away, but it turns out that the young woman's father is not the person that anybody wants him to be, including the father himself. Now, that sounds very elliptical. I think I probably mean it to be a bit elliptical. So I think it's fair to say that the men in the book are not as well drawn, perhaps, as the women. And that was partly deliberate, because I wanted to make this a book about women, and partly I think I find it easier to write women than to write men, if I'm honest with you.
I'm not sure that men are as, generally speaking, with a couple of exceptions, as sympathetic.
Yeah.
Although I was very struck by with Blaise and Joshua, the level at which they're both still enthralled to the past, and less less easy with the future. And maybe that is all of the characters in some ways. But with the two of them particularly,
Yes,
they're both making such an effort to escape
that's
the
a really
past.
interesting comment. Yeah, that's such an interesting comment. Actually, I hadn't really thought of that in such stark terms. But I think I think that's a really good idea. I think to an extent, quite a lot of the characters are quite stuck in the past, and one of the things I'm always quite interested in is why I find it easier to stick with old habits, even if I think they're not necessarily doing me many favors, than to actually change my behavior. And I think that to an extent, I think quite a lot of the characters in the book are that. It's the familiar is just easier, So even though frankly, you should change. So Joshua, who actually, I wrote, to be honest with you, so Joshua Wolf in the book is also in the city, and I decided to write someone I wanted to fall in love with. So I decided to write, if I was going to write a man, this is the one I was going to fall in love with. And he's a really sympathetic person. He's a bit messed up, but as all people we love are. But he's a very sympathetic person, and he's stuck in the past because he's the child of Holocaust survivors who basically, they were so scared of life, having been through what they'd been through, quite obviously, that they didn't want anything to befall their son, and they smothered him quite literally with love, and to an extent that he was so smothered as a young man that he finds it very difficult to give love as an older man. So although he's this tremendous human being and very principled and thoughtful and generous, actually he's got to a kind of fairly ripe old age without letting himself love, and then he meets Blaze, who's similarly, I think, also not doesn't have very good developed love muscles. And I don't mean that in any crude way, just mental ones. So the two of them, they have this absolutely hopeless attempt to try and get it together because they're both totally inept at courtship. So he's stuck in the past. Kitto, Jane's husband, is stuck in the past. He was, from the day he was born, he knew he was going to be the Earl of Trelawney. He went to Oxford, he went to Eton, he went to the right, he joined White's, he went to all the right clubs, he knew how to smoke a cigarette and look cool, he knew what the best tailor was, basically he was kind of, he never thought for a minute that he might have to reinvent himself because his life was absolutely set from the moment he was born. So he's stuck too. And then the only person in a way who isn't stuck is the kind of baddie of the novel, who's called Sir Tomlinson Sleet, who's an American short seller. So he's one of those guys that one reads about in the newspaper who goes in, buys a company, strips it of everything that's kind of that they can sell, and then marches off into the sunset, having made a tidy profit. So he's about money. He wants to make money. He wants to get on in the world. And I actually don't. I mean, it sounds like I dislike him as a character. I don't. I have quite a lot of sympathy for him. He wants to escape from quite a difficult kind of upbringing. He was adopted. He wasn't particularly wanted by his adopted parents. He's trying to create an identity for himself, but not necessarily in the most sympathetic way. So he oddly enough, he isn't trapped by his past, but he thinks that his happiest future might lie in copying Kitto Trelawney's kind of heritage, which again is a weird thing to do, but
I don't know. I don't want to disagree with you, but I think that Sir Tomlinson is a little bit trapped as well by his past.
Why? I'd love to hear why.
Because he's always trying to transcend it. Because he still lives his life in reference to it. And he's still driven by it, even if it's only the drive to escape. And in a way, Kitto and Blaze, and to a certain extent Joshua, are equally driven by the wish to make money. And yet they're maybe not as unconflicted about it. Tomlinson is very unconflicted about making money, but I think
Yeah.
he's equally devastated by his past.
I think that in a way, I love the way you put that. And do you think you're all damned to kind of relive our past over and over again, or do you think it's possible to escape?
I think it's possible to escape, but I think that it is very hard to completely escape the framework that we have grown up in, to escape our image of ourselves. And even when that image isn't about how other people, it's how we think other people see us and how we see ourselves. Blaze, who is trapped at some level by how she sees herself physically, and yet you consistently describe her as beautiful, which is not how she sees herself. And so it just,
Yeah.
I think it takes an awful lot of effort to escape, and I don't know that we ever really do. And then, of course, you play that with the future, with the juxtaposition of the past and the future, and
yeah, I'm not sure.
You have characters who are so they're convinced they understand the future. Kitto knows what his future is going to be. Blaze and Joshua make their livings predicting the future, even if Blaze continually resorts to fortune tellers. The future is very messy, and yet they're not characters who live in the present. They're either anticipating the future or stuck in the past, which makes a very interesting, sort of fight back and forth between the two sides.
I love your insights. I must say, it's a really, I feel that you're helping me learn more about my book, to be honest with you. No, it's really interesting because, sometimes it's in the process of writing, and I don't know, other people are writing books or writing things who are on this call, but, sometimes there are things, as when I said, I'd missed being cut off from readers, because there are things like what you've just talked about, which really help one kind of understand what one was saying. And I know that might sound a bit odd. I don't know what I was writing, but quite a lot of writing is quite instinctive and quite instinctual. So that it's the way that somebody reads what one's written which can shine a light, if that makes any sense. So, I mean, the great thing, isn't it, about literature is that we all read different stories into the same book. We all take something from a book which is slightly different. And here, I think what we're having, which is quite fascinating, is a conversation where you, as the reader, have seen something that I wasn't necessarily aware was there, quite honestly. So anyway, you make it sound very interesting. So thank you. Oh.
And I think one of the other elements that I liked was, we see several places early on in the book. We see, of course, the castle. We see Blaze's chic and soulless apartment in London, and we see Joshua's sort of self-conscious, rustic idyll of a farmhouse. And each of those locations says a lot about those characters and who live in them, or the people who live in them. And in thinking about these places, are you thinking? I think Blaze says early in the book that place is who we are, and the places that we live make us. And do you see your characters in these places, or do you see these places in your characters?
place and a sense of place is incredibly important. And characters, I mean, it's for me as a person, but actually my characters don't start to come alive until I can actually see them where they are in my mind's eye as I'm writing them. So where they live, how they live, is as important to me as what they look like or how they speak. And it's also quite fun. I mean, my career started, I was a filmmaker. So I had, you know, my first kind of language, if you like, was filmmaking, and was very visual. And as you know, as everyone knows, when you're making a film, you're telling a story in different dimensions. So there's the words, but also it's the visuals, obviously, which are for film as important as anything. So therefore, I think I carry that into my writing. And I absolutely knew, for example, I kind of knew who the castle came at the same time as the characters, and I knew what the characters were going to be like, and what their rooms were going to look like, and where the wallpaper had faded. And I even knew, for example, the sounds that the bathtub made when you turned the bathtub on, because in those old houses you turn on a tap and there's this very, very long kind of wait before the water makes its way from the boiler, which is often, you know, like half a mile away. And then there's this strange kind of clanking and gurgling, and often a kind of rushing sound as the water makes its way to the tap. And in quite a lot of these old houses, what comes out is not lovely clear water, it's kind of brown sludge. Yeah, you're nodding, exactly. We've all been there. Or sometimes it's bright green and you think, am I going to have a bath in that? You know, but actually either you're freezing cold because it's freezing, or you're dirty, so you have to. So I remember kind of thinking, there's a scene where, you know, where Jane has a bath. And I remember literally sitting, if you like, you know, looking down at her in this bathroom, and thinking about the taps and the noise it would make, and the noises of the house, and the clanking and the hissing of the tap. And that's fun, you know, that's the fun bit of writing. I think the fun bit of writing is really when you've got the kind of plot sorted out. This is how I work anyway. And then when the plot's sorted out, then you can really start thinking about those lovely details. And for me, thinking about place, back to your original point, is one of the nice details.
I spent my third year of university at St. Andrews in Scotland, living in a very old residence hall, where
okay.
Rooms with
okay.
the bathrooms
you know
were down the hall, and they didn't have heat because they hadn't installed heating ducts or radiators in those rooms. And so while you're waiting for, you know, the 20 minutes before the water shows up, you're freezing. It's terrible.
Freezing.
And then that sort of lingering smell of turnips.
Terrible.
But,
no, there was one house
about that.
Yeah. Turnips, God. There was one house I stayed in, which in a way inspired Trelawney. I feel very ungrateful because I was asked to stay in this house, but nevertheless, and the house was on the first floor, and there were 2 floors above the room I was sleeping in. And they showed me into my bedroom, you know, and I couldn't understand why there were lots of buckets and saucepans on the floor. I thought this is I kind of almost thought it was like a modern art installation. You know, why would there be a bedroom with lots of saucepans and buckets on the floor? Anyway, that night it rained, and even though there were 2 floors above me, the water found its way through 2 floors, and those saucepans and buckets have been put strategically to catch rainwater. It is. And to this particular family, they loved their house so much. They didn't mind that water came through the ceiling. What they minded was that they could stay there and live there. And I think that was something else I was trying to capture in the book, which is somebody says to one of them, why don't you sell it and go and live in a nice, you know, centrally heated flat, you know, in a nearby town, apartment, you would say, I think, not flat. And they look at her like, why would anyone want to do that? You know, there are a lot of sacrifices to be made, I think, to keep these places, intact. And I'm losing. Unfortunately, wait. I didn't quite hear that.
Oh, sorry. I can't help thinking of one of the plot points in Downton Abbey, which I think most of the audience has seen. When they're one of the many moments when they're at great risk of having to leave Downton, and they go to visit this other house that they might take, and it's still a huge house, but of course it could be managed with fewer servants and at less expense and in probable greater
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, good. I think that's right. I think that, but it's home. People want to stay home, don't they? And it's a bit like I was talking about earlier on with habits. Bad habits stick, and sometimes you just rather live with the bad habit.
So a question from the audience. AJ asks, both this book and Improbability of Love were shortlisted for the Woodhouse Prize for Comic Fiction, and one of them won. Were you thinking about some of the sort of the classic English comic fiction, Cold Comfort Farm or The Pursuit of Love, and how do you feel about a label that sort of calling it comic fiction as opposed to more serious literary fiction?
Well, I think all those books that you mentioned are books I absolutely love, and I don't personally, and if I can make somebody laugh, to be honest with you, wow, that's really exciting. I love to be able to make someone laugh, and I don't comic fiction has a kind of category, doesn't it? It's a kind of slightly stigmatized. Oh, it's funny, therefore it can't be serious, and which obviously that's what some people feel. But I personally think that there's room for all sorts of fiction, whether it's serious or thrillers. I mean, I think a great thriller can be really excellent fiction. I think a great comedic book can be excellent fiction. So I don't find comparisons to writers such as you mentioned Nancy Mitford or Stella Gibbons or anyone like that. I think that's a great compliment personally. P.G. Woodhouse. I was reading or rereading P.G. Woodhouse the other day. It's so clever because it looks like he writes. It looks like he's just kind of thrown off these sentences and these jokes. Actually, you can see also when you stop, you read it, how incredibly carefully he must have constructed each line. Apparently, he spent 2 or 3 years. I think he must have, rather like someone polishing a stone. He must have polished each joke over and over and over again in his head, and then it's quite difficult that making people laugh, isn't it? I think it's. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it's incredibly difficult, and he managed to do it 94 books across 70 years. So he must have been thinking about several simultaneously all the time, which must be a very neat trick. What was I going to say? Are either of your books in development for film?
They've both been one probability was optioned, and then that option's lapsed, and I'm in discussions with me about optioning Trelawney. So I would love both of them to to be made in TV or film. I mean, it would be absolutely wonderful. I won't write them, by the way, but I have written screenplays, and actually I'd just rather get on and write more books. I mean, that's what I really want to do. So, but I'd love to see them on the screen.
So I'm eagerly anticipating at the end of the summer when Pursuit of Love makes its way to the US. I've been reading the English reviews. and I'm excited for it. But I certainly understand not wanting to write your own screenplays. I've had friends who've gotten stuck writing screenplays for novels that they wrote years before, and then having to write them and rewrite them and rewrite them for projects that they had finished long ago. Um, I do think, though, in your book, one of the things that I like is that, as funny as it is, and it is very funny, that with the looming financial crisis, which we know is ahead for the characters, that it creates this wonderful sort of thrillerish foreboding in the first part of the book, um, which I thought gave the jokes more weight, and this sort of sense of looming doom, which was sort of wonderful.
Yeah, I do think all of our books are very different, but I remember I was actually making a movie. I was crashed, and I had to go to Moscow. I was filming a guy, and we were flying to Moscow, and we took off in the morning, and we landed in Moscow and turned on the television in the hotel room, and there was the announcement that Lehman Brothers had crashed, and I remember very, very clearly thinking, well, changed. And not in a way that I completely understood, but I had this real deep sense of foreboding that the collapse of this one bank would have this really, really profound effect on everyone, not just on the city, but or Wall Street, but all over the place. And indeed, I think that's happened. And my personal thing, and I'm going to explore this in the next Trelawney series I'm writing book 2 at the moment, is that what happened in 2008, the kind of consequences of that were played out really with the rise of nationalism, with characters like Trump coming forward in America, Boris Johnson in the UK, Brexit. There was a real desire, I think, kind of to find people who took control, who called out things that were wrong, drain the swamp, or in Boris's case, take control. I believe that those characters came to power a lot because of the consequences, I think, of the powerlessness that a lot of people felt following 2008. And in some of those four institutions that were around, that I think a lot of people felt very let down as well. What do you think about that?
Well, I do think that, I think part of what made the crisis so much more painful for everybody is how it revealed how, even at a very small level as an individual person, an old man or an old woman who's worked all these years and has their little nest egg for their future, and it turns out that it's not in their local bank. It's been packaged off, and is now under the control of somebody or an institution that doesn't know them, doesn't care about them, and could be in another country, and that we're all sort of interconnected in a way across the world in a way that we weren't before, or at least we didn't realize that we were before. And then this crash comes at a level that you don't feel that you're part of, and yet it rolls downhill towards you, and you're swept away, and the institution itself may not be. And then it sort of, you feel like, as an American, or as a person living in Britain, that maybe you want to circle the wagons and pull back and just sort of go native and protectionist, but it's too late. It's locking the door after the horse is gone. And so we turn to these strong men who tell us that they will protect us. They will get that horse back. We will all have horses again. And it just isn't so.
I think that's I think you very eloquently put, I think, really what happened, and in the House of Trelawney. So you You have every single person in the book is affected by 2008 in some way, shape, or form. So Tomlinson Sleet, who I mentioned before, who's the big financier, he makes an absolute killing. He has a kind of sense that of which way the market's going to go. He was actually tipped off by Blaise, funnily enough, ironically, who had been Blaise had been prophesying that that this was going to happen, and she had been trying to get people to listen to her for a long time. She'd been saying, and she'd been kind of written off as a kind of doomsayer. Oh my God, Blaise is at it again, saying the world's going to crash, the city's going to collapse. Boring, boring, boring. And she was 100% right. And of course, ironically, her nemesis Tomlinson did listen to her, and he went liquid, very shortly before the crash, and as a result, made an enormous amount of money. Kitto Trelawney bets the house. Basically, he thinks he can play the stock market. And the stock market, if you remember, is going up and up and up. So he takes out another mortgage on his castle, more borrowing against the castle. The stock market crashes. He finally loses the castle after 800 years. The family are out. Nothing, no roof over their head, not a cent. And then the family in the village of Trelawney, who've actually worked for the Trelawneys their whole lives, they put all their life savings into the bank that Kitto was running, because they thought, well, if a Trelawney thinks the bank is safe, our money is safe. So they lose everything. It's like this kind of awful kind of domino effect, and I think what I wanted to do was to have a situation in the book which really, not for the right reasons, brings everybody together. So everybody is in some way in the same soup, for want of a better word. And some people come out of it better than others. And the only real winner actually is Tomlinson Sleet. Everyone else loses. And that's, of course, what happened. We know that's what happened, isn't it? In the crash, most people lost. One or two people got very wealthy. Thanks to your then President Obama, who in my opinion, pretty much the world by by kind of coming into the rescue and getting rescue packages. It could have been a lot worse than it was, but it was still pretty bad. And I still think, as you rightly say, we've turned to strong men to try and help lead us out of this. Now, we could have another debate about whether the strong men are any good at leading us anywhere, but we won't get into that today. I'll leave that to you. You can sort that one out.
Oh yeah, that's my job. But it as I look back even over this past year, not to be mercenary and political, but the amount of money that Jeff Bezos has made since March of 2020 versus the average person, and he's made $86 billion or some such nonsense. A number so large that it's barely even conceivable.
I agree. It's crazy. It's great. And and can I just say, thank goodness for people like you and your bookshops, because I mean, I know Amazon sells things apart from books, but no, I honestly, hand on heart, writers couldn't succeed if it wasn't for people like you with your bookshops, because Amazon may be a very quick way to get a book, but there's nothing beats a bookseller who's read and digested and recommends. Nothing. And that's the reason that writers like myself can go on writing, because of your support. And I'm not just, I really mean that from the absolute pit of my stomach, by the way.
Thank you. So, question, something that I wonder about this book. We talk about, Kitto is, we blame Kitto in the book a lot, but I think we could just as easily blame his parents. I mean, I'm thinking about the funeral when Clarissa is thinking back to her father-in-law's funeral at a time when there were still hundreds of employees and tenants and staff. And even at the point that she is thinking about, at the minimum, they were outliers. But it seems that already so much must have already gone that they were already living well beyond their means. And that makes me wonder, there's nothing left. But is there really nothing? Or if it were only managed better, is there enough? Which may be a lesson for all of us.
Yes, I think that's a good question. And if only Clarissa could have had the self-awareness to actually say, is there a different way of living? Of course there would have been. I mean, they had land. They could have grown delicious vegetables. They could have invite other people in to come and work and live there. Not necessarily like kind of communes, and not saying in that way, but there are ways to make those houses work. There are different ways to live in a more kind of, to reinvent oneself, isn't there, for a modern era and for different circumstances. And I think it goes back a little bit to the point you made earlier, which is that they didn't really have the self-awareness, to any of these characters, to imagine a different way to live. They just couldn't imagine a different way. They could not see that that there was a difference. And eventually what happens is that they are actually forced to change because of losing everything. So they're then forced to open the house to the public. They're forced to try and think of the house in a rather different way. Rather than thinking the house is, a place to entertain the few, they suddenly have to work out, actually, this house is a place to entertain the many. And they end up opening Trelawney to the public. And ironically, of course, Clarissa, who the matriarch, the elderly matriarch, who is the most snobbish of all of them, reinvents herself, because guess what? She has an audience, and the people come and they pay £5 to walk around the house. And, oh my dear, I can tell them about me, and she takes them. And then not only that, she gets spotted by a local television station, who then decide that she is the best reality TV star of all time. I mean, eat your heart out, Sharon Osbourne. Here comes Clarissa Trelawney, and all the things that she was so proud of, like her manners, her snobbery, her her etiquette. Actually, people find hilarious. They think it's marvelous, and so she becomes this huge star. So, in spite of herself, she's forced to reinvent herself, and actually ends up loving it. And if only she'd done it 20 years earlier. She's, in a way, the one of all of them, the least likely to reinvent herself and the most successful. So, those who think that there isn't life after 80, go and look at Clarissa.
Well, I remember reading somewhere in someone's history book or biography that whatever else you can say about aristocrats is they survive, and they're sort of ruthless about it. And I think she finally wakes up and realizes that she can be ruthless, and she can do it to her own account. And it's a ruthless world for most of the characters, and the characters who can't live that way don't make it.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's in The Pursuit of Love, which you mentioned earlier, which is coming to the American TV screens quite soon, I hope. But this in the book, there's a wonderful scene, and if anyone hasn't read the book, The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford, it's just a complete joy. So I hope you agree, it's a joyous book. But I was friendly with one of the Mitfords, who then married the Duke of Devonshire, who is she's not Clarissa by any means, because Debo Devonshire, or Debo Mitford as she was one of the most kind of wonderful, charming, self-appreciating women. And she completely, by the way, when she inherited Chatsworth, it was after the war, this incredible house. And she turned it around and she opened it to the public, and she became a bit of a star. But when she was growing up with her sister Nancy, who wrote The Pursuit of Love, and her other sisters, her father, for fun, when the hunting season wasn't on, would smear little girls with ox excrement and then release them, and then set his bloodhounds on them and chase them. And the last child to get brought down by a bloodhound would get an extra boiled egg or sweet, you know. Now, so you talk about the aristocrats, of course they're tough. They have to be, you know. They're hunted by their father uses them as sport, and there are many, many, many stories, you know, like that. And so they, you know, they are tough, and they live in these enormous drafty houses, and you know, they had to kind of by their parents. I mean, I don't want to. Not every aristocrat neglected their child, but a lot of them did. So the children kind of brought themselves up, and I think you're absolutely right. They're tough. They have to be.
Well, it occurred to me. I was reading something about, you know, the transformation in English cooking over the past 50, 60 years, and it had come out of such a dark and sad place, in the 50s and 60s, and it seemed to me that you had this generation, of people who were scarred by the war, um, reeling from the loss of having had servants who could manage things, cook, keep the fires lit, bring the hot water. You know, that these houses were once the thing that made them comfortable was human labor. And once that went, how uncomfortable life really was, especially when you also think about decades of deferred maintenance. And then it's only in the last 20 or 30 years that you've got people who didn't grow up that way who are able to adjust to a different way of living. Um, Smaller rooms are easier to keep warm. You know, learning how to cook might actually produce better food. Um, all these things.
Yeah, I think now, you know, I mean, and I think lockdown was a very good example of this. You know, in lockdown, what do you really want? You wanted a house that you could clean easily, keep warm, and you know, etc., etc. You did not want to live, you know, in an enormous place. I don't know about anyone else, but you know, I spent far too much time in lockdown, you know, with my yellow marigold gloves cleaning baths. You know, I mean, it's like, oh, for God's sake, you know, it was kind of, you know, so. Um, but I guess it's, you know, we're a much more portable generation, aren't we? I mean, my children, for example, don't, you know, they wouldn't have a car, partly because, you know, why would you want to do that to the environment? Partly because they're lucky enough to live in town, so they don't need to drive. But also because if they do need to get something, they're supposed to develop, you know, something. So all there's been such a change, hasn't there? And actually, you know, similarly with food, if you want to, providing you live, you know, reasonably in the centre of town, you can get all sorts of food delivered to your door for remarkably little cost. Um, and you can also get all sorts of ingredients, so that if you want to cook something, you know, exotic or not even exotic, you can get all sorts of things. So I think we have so much more choice in lots of ways, don't we? And that the infantilization of people who lived like that, you know, who couldn't run their own baths, they couldn't iron a shirt, they couldn't lay a fireplace, you know, whatever it was, but they couldn't do anything. And I think personally, I love being independent. I find I wouldn't want to live like the kind of the characters in that book had lived once, or like they aspired to live.
Well, I like being independent, but I would prefer not to have to scrub my own bathtub. Um, but you know,
Yeah,
needs
I
must.
agree with you. By the way, 100%. Needs must, unfortunately. Yes, needs must. One has to do a bit of that occasionally.
So I know last spring, when we were stuck at home, and when the woman who comes in every couple weeks to clean wasn't coming in, how much, you know, I looked over one day and thought, are the steps always that dusty? And of course, they're not, because usually somebody else sweeps them and then mops them. And I realized that, you know, that needed to be done. And I was probably the person that had to do it. And it was very traumatizing.
You did know. And also the other thing, which sounds so split, and I really apologize for sounding so split, but to do it, it's incredible to do it really, really well is an art. I mean, I can clean a bath, but it's necessarily clean as bath and it's beautifully, whatever. So it's just, anyway. I think I have to steer away from this conversation because I'm going to sound like such a princess in a moment. So I'm going to try not to sound prince-like. Failing already, of course. Failing.
I could sound equally spoiled, I'm sure. You said you're working on a sequel?
Yes, so I'm writing. I found I couldn't. I really didn't want to let go of the characters at all, and I also found them quite unresolved. So I've decided to come back. So I've just completed the second draft of the House of Trelawney 2, which I'm going to call High Time. So you don't have to have read the first one, but the same characters will appear, and some of the characters actually from the improbability kind of pop up again because it's very difficult. Otherwise, you don't want to buy complete characters because you spend so much time with them, thinking about them and doing things with them and going for walks with them, and trying to work, as you say, think about where they live or what they like eating. So I'm having a lot of fun with that one, and this one takes the same cast of characters through to 2015-16, and it's set, I suppose, around the politics of that area, and also there's quite a lot of fun. The Albanian mafia come in. We have a bit of kind of Bitcoin. We have a bit of we have all sorts of skullduggery. Actually, I'm probably having a bit too much fun with this one. Actually, everyone's behaving really, really badly. I'm happy to tell you.
Yeah, Bitcoin. Oh boy, the whole cryptocurrency thing. I don't think we've seen anything yet.
You wouldn't let, would you?
Securitized debt is nothing compared to the boondoggle of Bitcoin.
And it is, and then also how, Mr. Musk, can come out and he can have one tweet and the whole lot kind of, drops by 30 or 40%, and then it kind of shoots up the net. I mean, I think it's a really interesting time the financial world and markets can be quite dry, but actually when you've got Bitcoin and you've got the whole kind of Robin Hood stuff, and as you said earlier on, you've got this extraordinary connectedness between different markets over the world. I find it absolutely riveting. And I think, as I say, I'm having a lot of fun. I mean, I'm having a lot of fun exploring these different and disparate areas.
Well, watching. There's so much more drama in it, and because it is so intimately connected to people's lives, it matters. And but I don't know. I feel sometimes very strongly that the less we want, the safer we are, or the better off we are. And yet, of course, through no fault of our own, even wanting a simple future, we're too connected, or we're so connected that we can't help being affected by the consequences of other people who want to live much larger. And it sounds weird and claustrophobic, but I don't mean it that way.
No, I don't think it sounds weird. I think I personally find it quite hard to turn off the want button, though, if I'm honest with you. I'd love to be someone who doesn't want things, but the truth is I do want things, and I really wish I wanted less. I wish I and I think for the sake of the planet and the environment and everything else, that's probably what we have to do. We'll have to adjust ourselves. Just, it's just wanting things and satisfying those wishes is just not, it's not going to be an option, is it? We'll have to kind of scale down.
I think so. If only there were a way to scale down in a way that was more equitable, where the necessary painful scaling down that we expect so many people to just take, while other people scale up and up and up. That doesn't seem quite right or quite fair or even sustainable.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think absolutely, whether you're looking at a macro level of saying that, people in India or poor parts of China can't burn coal and therefore can't study because, we've squandered the planet elsewhere, or whether it's, as you say, very conspicuous, unnecessary consumption somewhere. And I don't know, it is, I think that, without being gloomy about it, we are just going to have to change, but that can be a positive thing, because we can reconnect with things like cleaning baths and steps.
That's it. We're freed ourselves up to do
more.
that. That's exactly it. All right. Well, not to end on a gloomy note, this has been great fun. And I certainly appreciated the chance to talk to you today.
I've loved it.
And hopefully by the time the next book comes out, we will be touring again.
And thank you for your careful
you'll be able to visit. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you, everybody. Enjoy the weekend.
Lovely. Well, I hope to come and visit you one day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.